Fellas, it seems like in these past few years, a lot of ex-UFC stars have now left the UFC. Some of them have gone to go box. A lot of them have been interested in Jake Paul. Some of them are just in different MMA promotions. So I'm going to be taking a look at some of the biggest ex-UFC stars. So fighters that used to be in the UFC that either left or got cut or whatever. And how they could make a comeback to the UFC. Fights that are winnable for them. Fights that make sense. Some big fights as well. And if these guys were theoretically to make a comeback to the UFC, what would be the best route to take? So I've got a 3-fight deal for pretty much everyone on this list. And I'm not saying it makes sense for every single guy on this list to actually come back to the UFC. This is theoretically if they were to come back, who would I match them up against? So we'll go in there with the first fighter. And the first fighter I've got is Darren Till. Now, to be fair to Darren Till, his losses, his most recent loss has kind of aged well because he lost to Demetrius Johnson, who's the current champion of the world. So it isn't like he just lost to a bum. And he's definitely struggling, is Darren Till. You can see him begging for Jake Paul on Twitter. He's literally having to sell his old shoes to make some money. And he had a boxing match recently against a nobody. So if I was to bring Darren Till to the UFC, we need to give him a fight that's winnable and a fight that's going to get him back out there. So I will do Darren Till versus Wally Alves. Wally Alves is an absolute bum. He's kind of just known for being on the other end of highlight reels. And it's just an easy fight for Darren Till to get back in there. Like I said, he almost finished Demetrius Johnson in that fight that he had a couple of years ago. So I think Wally Alves is no match for Darren Till. It's a free fight for Till to get back in the UFC, get his name back out there, get some momentum, because the second that Darren Till beats Wally Alves, people are going to be talking about what's next for Darren Till. So I'd do him versus Wally Alves, a nice little warm-up, get his feet back in the UFC, and then from there we can start seeing bigger fights for Darren Till in the UFC, because Wally Alves, I mean, like I said, he's just really being known for being on the other end of people's highlight reels. He's on a 4-fight losing streak as well. He's won 1 fight over his last 5. His last winning streak was all the way back in 2018. So I would do Darren Till versus Wally Alves. Free win for Darren Till. Kick Wally Alves out the UFC, and it gets Darren Till back in the UFC with his confidence as well, because I feel like Darren Till, the biggest problem is his confidence. Like I said, he brings his confidence back. You know, he doesn't have to worry about, you know, losing again and then shattering his confidence. So gets him back in the UFC. Free win. Easy fight for Darren Till. That will be my first fight for Darren Till. Then the next fight, he's got the win over Wally Alves. He's going to want a bigger fight. We can't really push him in the rankings just yet, but he does need a bit of a big fight. I would do Darren Till versus Chris Weidman. This is another winnable fight for Darren Till. Chris Weidman hasn't looked good in his last few fights. I mean, obviously took a couple of years off after that leg injury, came back against Brad Tavares, got battered, and then got a robbery win over Bruno Silva, which he shouldn't have done with that IPOC situation. So it's another winnable fight. He's fighting an old man in Chris Weidman. He's not going to get smoked. I definitely favour Darren Till to win this fight. And it's just another winnable fight. And it's not just against another can. He's fighting a big name. Chris Weidman's a former champion known for beating Anderson Silva. He's a big name in the middleweight division, or at least he once was. So it's a big win for Darren Till to get on his resume. Again, I know he is fighting these old and washed fighters, but at this point, anything that can get Darren Till getting going and give him some momentum, I think he needs. So Darren Till, Chris Weidman. Imagine this is like a fight night main event. This is like a solid fight night main event, because they're two big names, or at least once they were big names who have kind of fallen off. It gives Darren Till momentum. It's a free win, and it just gets him closer to the ranking. I'm sure Darren Till wants to get closer to the rankings again. I feel like for Darren Till, title aspirations are probably over, but beating Chris Weidman, it definitely gets him closer to those rankings, and if he can get some momentum and he can beat Chris Weidman as well. And like I said, his last loss was to Demetrius Johnson, who's the current champion, and he didn't even do that bad at the beginning. So get him against Chris Weidman, it gets him closer to the rankings, and I just think it's probably a really favourable matchup for Darren Till. And then the third matchup for Darren Till, I would give him a ranked opponent at this point. Now, I wouldn't want to give him someone who's, you know, an up-and-coming prospect. I wouldn't want to give him like a Roman Kopylov or an Ikram Aliskerov. I'd do Darren Till versus Chris Curtis. Now, maybe this is too big of a step up from Chris Weidman, but it's a ranked opponent. If Darren Till can somehow beat Chris Curtis, he will now be in the rankings. So for Darren Till to go from not being in the UFC, known for being a bum who's looking for money, all the way to becoming a ranked middleweight in the UFC, that would be crazy for Darren Till. Not only that as well, it will be a fun build-up. Chris Curtis might be the biggest crybaby, the most salty dude on Twitter. I'm pretty sure he's now stopped training at the same gym with Sean Strickland because Strickland upset him. He argues back with everyone on Twitter. Chris Curtis is one of the most salty fighters in the UFC. And you know that Darren Till loves to troll. We saw it in the fight with Derek Brunson. So Darren Till trolling Chris Curtis would make for a hilarious build-up on like a pay-per-view, the press conference as well. Really fun build-up. And obviously that gets Darren Till's name back out there. And it's just a tough fight for Darren Till. It is a tough fight for Till. He's fighting Chris Curtis, who is a really good boxer and he's dangerous, but he doesn't have to worry about the threat of the takedown. It is a tough fight, but it's also an interesting fight as well. 2 high-level strikers, or at least 1 high-level striker going at it. Gets Darren Till back in the rankings. I think this is a really good fight for Darren Till. So that would be my free fight deal to get Darren Till back in the UFC, get his name back out there, give him some momentum, give him some good fights, and get him back in the rankings. So that would be what I would do for Darren Till. Then we have Jorge Masvidal. He's hinted towards the fact that he wants to come back to the UFC, but again, I'm not sure he really does. He's coming off that robbery loss to Nate Diaz in boxing. The first fight I would give to Masvidal, we don't need to give him any massive fights right now. If he was to have a 3-fight deal in the UFC, give him Neil Magny. Okay, maybe it's a bit of a fall to go from like Nate Diaz all the way to Neil Magny, but it's an easy win. Unless Neil Magny finds a way to win, because Neil Magny is one of the most inconsistent dudes in the UFC. But it is, I'd say this is a very comfortable win for Darren Till, and it's a ranked opponent as well. He's not fighting an unranked dude. He's getting in the welterweight rankings. Give him Neil Magny. It's an easy win for Darren Till. Might even be able to get the highlight reel over Neil Magny, and not Darren Till, Jorge Masvidal, and he gets him back in the winning column. So Jorge Masvidal, Neil Magny, get Masvidal back in the UFC. This could be like for a featured fight of a pay-per-view, or just stick it on the main card of a pay-per-view. Easy first fight for Jorge Masvidal. Then we need to kind of step it up a little bit. Jorge Masvidal versus Kevin Holland. This should have happened after the Gilbert Burns fight, but then obviously Masvidal retired because he wanted to go box. This is a fight that I've been waiting for since the fight with Gilbert Burns, because they both have a rivalry. I don't know if you saw, but leading up to the fight with Gilbert Burns, they were both fighting each other backstage. They've got a big rivalry, and they both know how to build a fight. Kevin Holland's great at promoting. Jorge Masvidal's a great promoter. They would sell this fight. You stick this on a pay-per-view, it's like a co-main event. That's a massive co-main event for a pay-per-view. Also on top, it's a 50-50 fight. I don't know if this is just an easy win for Masvidal anymore, because Kevin Holland's dangerous. He's a good fighter, and he's a bit of a weird fighter where he just kind of pulls off wins every now and then. He's fairly well-rounded too, and he's fairly dangerous is Kevin Holland. Masvidal's kind of washed, so I'd still say this is a 50-50 fight. I can't say this is an easy win for Masvidal, but that makes the fight even bigger, you know, that sells the fight even more. Him versus Holland, they're building a fight together. It's 50-50. And it's a mega fight to stick on the pay-per-view. Like I said, this is a really big fight because they were both promoted really well. They're two fairly big names in the welterweight division. At least Masvidal once was a massive name. Sticking on a pay-per-view, great addition. Gives Masvidal his second win. Now, if Masvidal does beat Kevin Holland, if he actually theoretically gets the win over Kevin Holland, which would be a good win for Jorge Masvidal, he's definitely going to be fighting a top 10 ranked opponent, but I don't think he should fight any contenders. The contenders are going to beat Masvidal. He doesn't need to be fighting any contenders. Let's give him one more fun fight. Jorge Masvidal versus MVP. This would be such a fun fight. I mean, MVP, this would definitely be his biggest fight to date on paper, fighting a former title challenger fight and one of the ex-biggest stars in the UFC. MVP and Jorge Masvidal going at it would be massive. It's such a fun fight as well. You've got two great strikers. Obviously, MVP, one of the best strikers in the UFC. Masvidal, he's definitely fallen off a little bit, but he still has decent striking. Such a fun fight on paper. The second reason I want to see this fight is that it's an interesting clash of styles. Like I said, Masvidal, I feel like Masvidal will be able to time MVP perfectly, but at the same time, MVP might be able to read Masvidal. It'll be an interesting clash of styles because of how different they are on the feet and how completely different styles they have on the feet. But they are both strikers, so it would be interesting to see. And again, it's a big fight. MVP, he's a fairly big star in the welterweight division. Potential future contender, I don't know, especially after that loss to Ian Gary. But at least neither of them have to worry about grappling. It would be a pure striking matchup. At this point, they would have both beaten Kevin Holland. So MVP versus Masvidal. For Masvidal's final fight in the UFC, because Masvidal, we don't need to feed him to any contenders. I don't really care about the fight with Nate Diaz anymore. We've seen it twice. Masvidal, MVP, give him his last fight, and maybe if he does beat MVP, he might then, you know, try and go on a bit of a title run. But yeah, I think that's the 3-fight deal I would do for Darren Till. 3 very, not winnable fights, but 3 fun fights for Masvidal to get him back in the UFC. And then we've got Mike Perry, the BKFC GOAT, the guy who just lost to Jake Paul. Now, Mike Perry's is going to be a little bit different to everyone else's on this list, and you'll see why. The first fight I would do for Mike Perry is Jake Paul, but in PFL. Jake Paul, he's been calling out everyone, Nate Diaz, Masvidal, Mike Perry in PFL. They went and did a podcast together recently. I think they want to fight in PFL, and if that actually happens, I know he's not in the UFC, but he gets to butcher a massive name. In PFL, Mike Perry would absolutely butcher Jake Paul. He would destroy him. He gets to get that fight over Jake Paul, butchers him, a big name in combat sports, whether you like it or not, because Jake Paul is a fairly big star now. And he just gets to butcher him. That gives him a free highlight reel. It gets him winning MMA again. We haven't seen Mike Perry in MMA for years. He's gone to BKFC and then boxing, so it gets him back in the winning column just for MMA and in general as well, because he's coming off that loss to Jake Paul. So it gets him winning in MMA. It gets him training in MMA as well against basically a free win. And everyone forgets about the boxing loss. If Mike Perry goes out there and butchers Jake Paul in boxing, the world of combat sports are going to be thankful, in MMA, sorry. The world of combat sports is going to be thankful thankful for Mike Perry. Everyone's going to be on his side. Everyone will forget that performance that Jake Paul did in boxing because we're all going to be looking at the fact that, well, the butchering that Mike Perry gave to Jake Paul in PFL. If this fight actually goes down, Mike Perry's going to maul him, and it gives him some serious momentum in MMA. Now, assuming that this is going to be a one-fight deal in PFL, and he was then to come to the UFC, the first fight I would do to Mike Perry in the UFC, now I don't know what weight this would be at because Mike Perry's looking a little bit heavy these days, so I reckon it'd be like 185, maybe if he could make it 170. Mike Perry versus Nate Diaz. This is a massive comeback fight in the UFC for both of them as well, but specifically for Mike Perry to go and butcher Jake Paul in PFL and then come back to the UFC is a big name, fighting another big name in Nate Diaz. This is a massive comeback fight for the UFC, one of the biggest non-title fight pay-per-views you can make. Yeah, just two, I mean, one, it'd just be a fun fight to see. The second reason, it's 50-50 as well. Mike Perry didn't look too good in MMA towards the end of his career, which is why they let him go. He was getting butchered by a lot of these welterweights. Nate Diaz is a bit weird because he never really looks good, but he still finds a way to win. He did it in the Masvidal boxing match. He lasted against Jake Paul. He did it against Tony Ferguson. So, honestly, at this rate, I'd say this is probably a 50-50 fight in MMA. And the third reason is it's an easy pay-per-view between two returning stars. They've both fought Jake Paul in boxing. Both of them have lost. Both of them would smoke, and maybe at this point, Mike Perry would have smoked Jake Paul in PFL. This is just an easy big pay-per-view for two of them to come back to. Mike Perry, Nate Diaz in MMA, in the UFC. This is an easy pay-per-view because they've gone and built their self-name. Well, I mean, Nate Diaz was already a big name, but Mike Perry, he left the UFC, made a name for himself. For him to come back to the UFC and face Nate Diaz, this is a massive fight. And again, the build-up would be hilarious between the two of them. And the third fight, maybe this is a bit of a drop from Nate Diaz. Maybe this isn't a big name, but if we're talking winnable fights in a free fight contract, Mike Perry versus Paul Craig. This is actually very winnable for Mike Perry because Paul Craig's not well-rounded and he's not really good. He's got good jiu-jitsu, he's got a really good triangle choke, and he's good at getting people in guard, and apart from that, he's kind of like a fish out of water. Mike Perry would piece Paul Craig up on the feet, and if he has the correct training camp with the correct people, I think this is actually very winnable for Mike Perry. Arguably more winnable than the Nate Diaz fight, because what does Paul Craig really have? He's been getting finished in all of his recent fights, he's getting washed. It's a very winnable fight for Mike Perry, and of course, Paul Craig would take this fight against a big star. Second reason, probably gets him a ranked fighter. Now, again, I'm not saying Mike Perry necessarily needs to go on a title run, and I'm not saying him versus the ranked guys in the middleweight division would be competitive, especially at the current state of the division, but it does get him a ranked opponent if he does beat Paul Craig, or at least it probably would, because Paul Craig, I mean, before his last fight, he was ranked. And it isn't a massive drop. It's not like he's gone from fighting a Nate Diaz to a who. We all know Paul Craig. He's not this big name, but he's kind of notorious for beating Ankalaev and Jamal Hill, so it isn't a massive drop. Would he be selling the same pay-per-views as Nate Diaz? No. It probably wouldn't even be the co-main event or the featured fight for a pay-per-view, or maybe it would be, but Mike Perry, Paul Craig, easy fight for Mike Perry, gets him ranked again, and I just think this is a good fight to make if he was to beat Nate Diaz, and he had a free fight winning streak in the UFC, so that'll be Mike Perry. Then we've got Demetrius Johnson, the flyweight GOAT, currently competing in ONE FC, even though he's been inactive for quite some time. The first fight I would do for Demetrius Johnson in the UFC is an immediate title shot, Alejandro Pantoja. It is the biggest fight you can make in the flyweight division. It is a mega fight for the flyweight division. The flyweight division is kind of dead in the UFC. You know, everyone kind of hates on the flyweight division. This would bring eyes back to it because I feel like for Demetrius Johnson, he only really started to become popular and only really started to have a fan base after he left the UFC and got traded for Askren. Now that he's in ONE FC, he's a massive, well, I won't say he's a massive star, but he's a very big name. People want to see how he'd compete in the UFC. Him versus the current defending flyweight champion who seems to be unstoppable. That would be a massive mega fight you can make in the UFC, and I wouldn't even mind if this is a main event for a pay-per-view. It's the best flyweight versus the best flyweight, the greatest flyweight of all time, the best flyweight right now in ONE FC against the best flyweight in the UFC. And if Demetrius Johnson was able to beat Pantoja, that would be a massive statement. And if Pantoja can beat Demetrius Johnson, that's another big win for Alejandro Pantoja, gets his name out there, builds his profile. It's the best versus the best, and it welcomes Demetrius Johnson back to the UFC. You know, I feel like Demetrius Johnson probably has a bit of a bitter taste in his mouth after the UFC let him go for Askren, but if he can join the UFC and get an immediate title shot and become the champion again, especially with a bigger fan base than he's ever had, that just welcomes Demetrius Johnson back to the UFC. DJ Pantoja. Now, assuming at this point DJ, you know, he's got 3 fights in the UFC and he needs to defend his belt, there's also another big star who wants to join the UFC, so he's not going to be fighting an already existing UFC fighter. He's going to be fighting somebody else who's in the same position of him coming to the UFC. Demetrius Johnson versus Kai Asakura. Now, if you're wondering who the hell Kai Asakura is, it's been pretty much confirmed that this massive star in Japan in flyweight MMA, or I don't know if it's bantamweight or flyweight, but he's going to be coming over to the UFC, and he's going to be, having a massive fight. This would be big. Kai Asakura is a huge star in Japan. To have the greatest flyweight of all time, the biggest flyweight star in the UFC, at least at this time, against the biggest Japanese star, that's another massive fight. You can make that as like a pay-per-view main event. It's the flyweight GOAT, like I said, versus the biggest Japanese star. That sells itself. Really competitive fight as well. Well, I don't know if it would be competitive. I reckon Demetrius Johnson would fold him, but you know what I mean. And it would be somewhat competitive, I guess, but we'll have to see. But Demetrius Johnson, Kai Asakura, one up-and-coming flyweight versus one GOAT. I think that's the second good fight for Demetrius Johnson in the UFC. And then his third fight in the UFC. I mean, this could be anyone, to be honest, but I'd do Tatsuro Taira as his final defense in the UFC. He's not trying to go on another title run, but assuming that he's already won the belt and got a defense at this point, he's already lapped himself. I mean, he's been a champion before. For him to come back to the UFC and defend it again, he's definitely going to be, one of the... I mean, he already is one of the greatest of all time, but this would definitely put the respect on his name that people haven't been given before. His final defense against Tatsuro Taira, another Japanese star. If the Japanese star, the Japanese fans are going to be looking at him beating Kai Asakura, maybe they tune in to watch Tatsuro Taira. You've got undefeated Tatsuro Taira versus the greatest of all time, another storyline that you can make. And I feel like these are the three biggest fights you can make for Demetrius Johnson right now in the flyweight division. 3 winnable fights for Demetrius Johnson, but 3 fights that actually mean something as well. So if Demetrius Johnson was to come back to the UFC, which I don't think he ever will, but if he was, that would be the route that I would give Demetrius Johnson. Then we've got Nate Diaz now. The first fight for Nate Diaz, I mean, I've already talked about this, Mike Perry, it's a double comeback for both of them. It would be a hilarious build-up as well. Imagine the press conference between Mike Perry and Nate Diaz, and it's winnable for both. I've already gone over this matchup where I talked about Mike Perry, but I feel like if Nate Diaz is to come back to the UFC, a 50-50 fight with Mike Perry wouldn't hurt. I think this would be pretty fun. And then for Nate Diaz, assuming that he's fought Mike Perry, and if he had beaten Mike Perry, then, or maybe he'd lost to Mark Perry, I'm not sure, but I would do Nate Diaz versus the loser of Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler. Now, that fight's going to be taking place at 170. I'm hoping it's going to be later this year. It's either going to be a massive trilogy of Conor McGregor. If McGregor loses to Chandler, I still think that the fight with him and Diaz is going to be massive because they're 1-1 against each other. It's a massive fight. The build-up would be absolutely hilarious. Way better than the build-up with him and Chandler. McGregor versus Nate Diaz if McGregor loses to Chandler. And it makes sense as well because McGregor's got 2 fights left on his contract. Chandler will be one of them. Diaz could be the other one as well. McGregor versus Diaz. And if Chandler loses, it's still a super fight with Michael Chandler. He's now a household name for losing to McGregor. Him versus Nate Diaz, another massive fight. So Nate Diaz is getting a big star regardless. Now, I wouldn't do a third fight for Nate Diaz because I don't really think there's any other stars that he can fight, and I just don't see Nate Diaz fighting in the UFC if it's not against a big star. So that'd be it for Nate Diaz, but if you can think of anyone else that makes sense for him, I mean, I guess there's Masvidal, but I don't really have any interest in watching that fight again. So that would be my 2-fight deal for Nate Diaz. And then we've got Chris Mutino, the guy that had that iconic fight with Sean O'Malley and just kept walking forward and eating shots, and he's left the UFC and put together quite a good win streak, so I think we should welcome him back to the UFC. Now, the first fight for Chris Mutino is Yanis Gamore, the guy who just got beaten by Peyton Talbot. This is an easy win for him to get back in the UFC. It's literally a free win to give Chris Mutino back in the UFC, and he's going to have a little bit of a fan base from the people that remember him fighting O'Malley. Easy win to get Chris Mutino back in the UFC, get him back in the winning column, and he would have put together a bit of a streak if he can beat Yanis Gamore. It's also the Sean O'Malley victim versus the Peyton Talbot victim. Obviously, Chris Mutino got battered by Sean O'Malley. Yanis Gamore got KO'd by Peyton Talbot. You've got the champions victim versus the prospects victim, so I guess you can also use that to sell the fight. And it's low-key a banger of a matchup. Yanis Gamore, he's not the best defensively, but he's not that bad of a kickboxer. Same for Chris Mutino. He likes blocking punches with his head, but he just walks forward and bangs. This would be no defense, all offense between the two of them, and I think this would make for an actual really good fight, an absolute war to put Chris Mutino back in the UFC, but I do see him definitely beating Yanis Gamore. Now, the second fight, again, we can't really feed him to a killer because he has just beaten a can. I'd do Chris Mutino versus Brian Kelleher. Another easy win. Brian Kelleher's on a 4-fight losing streak. He's kind of only really been known for being on the other end of, basically building other people's resumes for them. He did it to Cody Garbrandt. He did it to Umar Nurmagomedov. It's just an easy win to give Chris Mutino some more momentum. Get him some more momentum. Get him on a 2-fight winning streak in the UFC. It sets up a bigger fight if he wins as well. If Chris Mutino can beat Brian Kelleher and he can beat Yanis Gamore, the UFC are going to be looking looking for some bigger fights for Chris Moutinho after he beats Brian Kelleher. So it sets up a bigger fight, and he can compare his performance with Cody Garbrandt. If Chris Moutinho goes out there and smokes Brian Kelleher in the first round, that's going to look really good considering how long it took Cody. Well, it didn't take him long, but considering Cody Garbrandt's performance. So we can kind of match and compare his performance with Cody Garbrandt so that we can kind of see how good Chris Moutinho is. Him versus Brian Kelleher in the second fight. And then the third fight that I would do for Chris Moutinho, assuming that he'd already won those two, is him versus Ricky Simón. He's fighting a former ranked fighter. If he can beat and fight Ricky Simón, that kind of shows that he's still able to fight in the UFC, and he shouldn't have been cut and he shouldn't be cut. Him versus Ricky Simón, he's fighting a former ranked fighter, which is obviously big for Chris Moutinho. And if he can beat Chris Moutinho, if he can beat Ricky Simón, and you know what, I wouldn't even write that off because he's fighting the worst version of Ricky Simón. Recently, Ricky Simón has been looking kind of terrible. He hasn't really been changing his game plan up at all. His fight IQ is kind of questionable as well. Barely even shot a takedown when he fought Oliveira, so he is fighting one of the worst versions of Ricky Simón. And the third reason, if he can beat Ricky Simón, if Chris Moutinho, who by the way has good grappling, if he can beat Ricky Simón, that gets him a big fight, maybe even a ranked opponent, or at least a big fight in the bantamweight division. So that would be my matchmaking for Chris Moutinho, but that will be how I matchmake ex-UFC stars into bigger fights. Let me know your thoughts on these matchups and if you agree with them, and if there was any fighters I missed out, but let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.